I recognise quite a few people here for the rest of the weekend, but I'm just going to send this contact sheet around in case you want to sign up and find out more about what's happening in Vienna. Okay, so I'd like to thank everyone for coming this evening. I'm excited about this panel because I think it touches upon a lot of really critical questions in our contemporary moment. I'm going to start off by reading the panel description that was put together for this panel. The crisis of neoliberalism. The left has, for over a generation, for more than 40 years, since the crisis of 1973, placed its hopes in the Democratic and Labour parties to reverse or slow neoliberal capitalism, the move to transnational trade unions, the movement of capital and labour, and austerity. The post-2008 crisis of neoliberalism, despite phenomena such as SYRIZA, Occupy Wall Street, the Arab Spring, anti-austerity protests, and more generally Bernie Sanders' candidacy and Jeremy Corbyn's Labour leadership, has found expression on the avowed right through UKIP, Brexit, the UK Conservatives' move to red Toryism, and now Donald Trump's election in the US. The old neoliberal consensus is falling apart, and change is palpably in the air. Margaret Thatcher's infamous phrase, "there is no alternative," has been proven wrong. What can the left do to advance the struggle for socialism under such circumstances? In the 1960s, the left faced political and social crises in the era of full employment and economic growth. Departing from official communism, which had largely supported the development of the welfare state in industrialized capitalist countries, many on the left challenged the existing political order of Keynesian-Fordism through community organizing on the principle of expanding individual and collective freedom from the state. Against Keynesian economic demands, many of these leftists supported the right's efforts to integrate formerly oppressed identity groups into the corporate professional managerial class. Since the 1970s, the significance of the fact that all these aims were taken up politically by the right in the name of freedom in the form of neoliberalism is still ambiguous today. Some on the left have understood this phase of neoliberalism to be continuous with the post-war Fordist state, for example in Ernst Mandel's conception of late capitalism and David Harvey's idea of post-fordism. The movement of labour and capital was still administered by the Fordist state. Distinctively, others on the left have opposed neoliberalism for over a generation through a defence of the post-war welfare state, through appeals to anti-austerity and anti-globalisation. How does this distinction within the left between the defence of the welfare state and defence of individual freedom affect the left's response to the crisis of neoliberalism? Why has the left recently supported attempts to politically manage the economic crisis post-2008 against attempts at political change? How can the left struggle for political power with the aim of overcoming capitalism and achieving socialism when the political expression of the crisis of neoliberalism has largely come from the right and Trump won the election in November? Okay, so just to introduce our speakers, from the end we have Chris Petrone, who is president of the Platypus Affiliated Society and professor at the School of the Art Institute in Chicago. We then have John Milios, who for 5 to 6 years was a member of the Politburo of SYRIZA and responsible for economic policy from 2010 to 2014-15. He's a professor of political economy at the National Technical University in Athens, and since 1982 has run a Marxist journal in the Greek language called Thesis. Next we have Emmanuel Tomaselli, who is a member of the International Marxist Tendency here in Vienna, and also on the editorial board of Funke. And finally, I'm very pleased to welcome Boris Kargalitzky, who is director of the Institute of Globalisation Studies and Social Movements in Moscow. Okay, so I'm going to ask our panelists to speak for 10 to 12 minutes, and I'm going to start at the far end with Chris. After that, there'll be a couple of minutes for the speakers to respond to each other, and then we'll open it up for questions. Thank you very much. Chris, would you like the this?
Okay. The title of my presentation is The Crisis of Neoliberalism and Marxism in the Age of Trump. The present crisis of neoliberalism is a crisis of its politics. In this way, it mirrors the birth of political neoliberalism in the Reagan-Thatcher revolution of the late 1970s, early 1980s. The economic crisis of 2007-2008 has taken 8 years to manifest as a political crisis. Very much like Thatcher's election in 1979 and Reagan's election in 1980 was a delayed response to the 1973 crisis. That political crisis, the current one, was expressed by SYRIZA's election in Greece, Jeremy Corbyn's rise to leadership of the Labour Party, the Brexit referendum, and Bernie Sanders, as well as Donald Trump's campaign for president. Now Trump's election is the most dramatic expression of this political crisis of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism itself has been an unclear concept, often substituting for capitalism. It clarifies to regard neoliberalism as politics. It is neoliberal politics that is in crisis. It is easy to mistake Trump as an anti-neoliberal politician. This is what it means to call him a right-wing populist. Presumably then Sanders, Corbyn, and SYRIZA are left-wing populist movements. This suggests that democracy and neoliberalism are in conflict. But neoliberalism triumphed through democracy, as demonstrated by the elections and re-elections of Thatcher, Reagan, Bill Clinton, Tony Blair, and Barack Obama. Neoliberalism is a form of democracy, not its opposite. If neoliberalism is a political crisis, then this is a crisis of democracy. Perhaps this is what it means to distinguish between populism and democracy. When the outcome of democracy is undesirable, as apparently with Trump, this is attributed to the perversion of democracy through populism, that is to say, through demagoguery. Capitalism and democracy have been in tension, if not exactly in conflict, for the entirety of its history. But capitalism has also been reconstituted through democratic means. For instance, FDR's New Deal, to save capitalism from itself, was achieved and sustained through small d democratic politics. But that form of democratic politics experienced a crisis in the 1960s and 1970s. That crisis is what gave rise to neoliberalism, which found an opportunity not only in the post-1973 economic downturn, but also, and perhaps especially, through the crisis of the Democratic Party's New Deal coalition and its related politics. This was mirrored elsewhere, such as in the UK and the rise of Thatcher's neoliberal revolution against not only Labour, but also against the established Conservative Party. The same with Reagan, who had to defeat the Nixonite Republican Party as well as the Great Society Democrats. Similarly, Trump has had to defeat the neoliberal Republican Party as well as the neoliberal Democrats. Just as David Harvey found it helpful to describe neoliberalism not as anti-Fordism, but as post-Fordism, it is necessary to consider Trump not as an anti-neoliberal, but as a post-neoliberal. There will be continuity as well as change. There will be a political realignment of mainstream liberal democratic politics, just as happened with FDR or with Reagan. The left, that is the Communist Party, initially called FDR a fascist, we should always remember, just as the New Left called Reagan a fascist when he was elected, as if liberal democracy were collapsing rather than experiencing a political transformation. Such hysteria amounts to thinly veiled wishful thinking. The problem with the left is that its hysterics are less about society than about itself. The left cries foul when mainstream politics steals its thunder, when change happens from the right rather than through the left's own quote-unquote revolutionary politics. Capitalism has continued and will continue through political revolution of greater or lesser dramatic character. Avowed Marxists have failed to explain the past several transformations of capitalism. Neither the Great Depression nor the crisis of the New Deal coalition leading to the New Left of the 1960s and 70s, nor the crisis of Fordist Indeed, each change was met with panic and futile denunciation. As such, the left's response has actually been affirmative. By the time the left began to try to make sense of the changes, this was done apologetically, justifying and thus legitimating in retrospect the change that had already happened. Such explanation may serve as substitute for understanding, but reconciling to change and grasping the change, albeit with hindsight, let alone taking political opportunity for change, is not the same as adequately critiquing the change. What is needed, what is indeed required, is seeing how a crisis and change might point beyond itself. What is the Trump phenomenon as an indication of possibilities beyond it? This is the question that must be asked and answered. Unfortunately, the only way the left might be posing this question now is in order to advise the Democrats on how to defeat Trump. But this is to dodge the issue. For even if the Democrats were to defeat Trump, this might avoid but cannot erase the crisis of neoliberalism, which is not an accident of the 2016 election outcome, but a much broader and deeper phenomenon. The heritage of 20th century Marxism, quote-unquote, that of both the old left of the 1930s and the new left of the 1960s, does not facilitate a good approach to the present crisis and possibilities for change. Worse still is the legacy of the 1980s post-new left of the era of neoliberalism, which has scrambled to chase after events ever since Thatcher and Reagan's election. A repetition and compounding of this failure is manifesting around Trump's election now. For instance, while David Harvey's work from the 1980s, his 1989 book on the condition of postmodernity, was very acute in its diagnosis of the problem, his work from more recent years forgot his earlier insights in favor of a caricatured account of neoliberal political corruption. This played into the prevailing sentiment on the left that neoliberalism was more or less superficial political failure that could be easily reversed by simply electing the right, that is to say, the correct Democratic Party or UK Labour politicians. More specifically, the millennial left now, that grew up initially against the Iraq War under George W. Bush and then continued in Occupy Wall Street under Obama, and last year got behind the Sanders campaign, is particularly ill-equipped to address Trump. It is confounded by the crisis of neoliberalism to which it had grown too accustomed in opposition. Now with Trump, it faces a new and different dilemma. This is most obvious in the inability to regard the relationship between Sanders and Trump in the common crisis of both the Republican and Democratic parties in 2015-2016. Just as the New Left, and then neoliberalism itself, expressed the crisis of the Democratic Party's New Deal coalition, Trump's election expresses the crisis of the Reagan coalition of the Republican Party, a crisis of not only neoliberalism as economic policy in particular, but also of neoconservatism and of Christian fundamentalist politics, as well as of Tea Party libertarian and strict constructionist constitutional conservatism. Trump represents none of these elements of the Reaganite Republican heritage, but expresses the current crisis common to all of them. He also expresses the crisis of Clintonism and Obamaism. So did Sanders. Marxists and the left, more generally, have been very weak in the face of such phenomena, ever since Reagan and up through Bill Clinton's presidency. Neoliberalism was not well processed in terms of actual political possibilities. But now it is too late. Whatever opportunity neoliberalism had presented is past. It was appropriate that in the Democratic Party primaries, the impulse to change was expressed by Bernie Sanders, who predated the Reagan term. Discontent with neoliberalism found an advocate for returning to a pre-neoliberal politics of the New Deal and the Great Society. While Trump's Make America Great Again sounded like nostalgia for the 1950s, actually, it was more a call for a return to the 1990s, to Clintonite neoliberal prosperity and untroubled U.S. global hegemony. In the 2016 campaign, Sanders was more the 1950s-60s style Democratic Party figure. Indeed, his apparent age and style seem to recall the 1930s, even though obviously he's not that generation. And not so much the New Left counterculture, whatever youthful writings of his that were dug up. What's remarkable is that Sanders invoked the very New Deal coalition Democratic Party that he had opposed as a socialist in his youth. and what had kept him independent of the Democrats when he first ran for elected office in the 1980s Reagan era, during which the Democrats were still the majority congressional party. Sanders, who had opposed the Democrats, now offered to save them by returning them to their glory days. But Trump succeeded where Sanders failed. It is only fitting that the party that led the neoliberal turn under Reagan should experience the focus of the crisis of neoliberal politics. In other words, the Republicans conducted neoliberalism, and so it's appropriate that they experience the crisis of neoliberalism most strongly. If Sanders called for a political revolution, however vaguely defined, Trump has effected it. Trump has even declared that his campaign was not simply a candidacy for office, but a movement. His triumph is a stunning coup, not only for the Democrats, but the Republicans as well. Where Sanders called for a groundswell of quote-unquote progressive Democrats, Trump won the very narrowest of possible electoral victories. Like, it's almost impossible to imagine a narrower victory than Trump's. Nonetheless, it was well-calculated strategy that won the day. Trump's victory is the beginning, not the end, of a process of transforming the Republican Party, as well as mainstream politics more generally. That is his avowed goal. Steve Bannon announced that his main task was to unelect recalcitrant Republicans. Trump's economic advisor, Stephen Moore, a former neoliberal, declared to congressional Republicans that it was no longer the old Reaganite neoliberal Republican Party, but was going to be a quote-unquote new economic populist party. Trump said during the campaign that the Republicans should not be a conservative party, but rather a working-class party. We shall see whether and how he may or may not succeed in this aim, but he will certainly try, if only to retain the swing working-class voters he won in traditionally Democratic Party voting states, such as in the Midwest Rust Belt. Trump will seek to expand his electoral base, the base for a transformed Republican Party. The Democrats will necessarily respond in kind, competing for the same voters as well as expanding their electoral base in other ways. Is this a process of democratization, this struggle for votes? Yes and no. The question is not of more or less democracy, but rather how democracy takes shape politically. Populism is a problematic term because it expresses fundamental ambivalence about democracy itself, and so fails to clarify the issue. It is understood that new and expanded political mobilization is fraught with danger. Nonetheless, it is a fact of life for democracy, for good or for ill. The frightening specter of angry white voters storming onto the political stage is met by the sober reality that what decided Trump's victory were voters who had previously elected Obama. So the question is the transformation of democracy, of how liberal democratic politics is conducted by both Democrats as well as Republicans. This was bound to change, with or without Trump. Now with Trump, the issue is posed point blank. There's no avoiding the crisis of neoliberalism.
So, John.
Okay. My first remark or question is about your thesis that Trump is a response, or what happened in the 2017 elections was a response to the crisis. And I would like to ask why not to the movements. Of course, the movements have to do with the crisis, but we have the Occupy Wall Street, and before that, the movement in Seattle and the anti-globalization movement a decade before. So I think that this has created a whole situation, and we might see Trump as a response to that. My second point, which is connected with the first one, is the following, that we have to see bourgeois strategies, the strategies of the mainstream parties, as some forms of consensus with parts of the ruled classes. And when I say the ruled classes, I do not mean the laboring classes, also the small entrepreneurs, the self-employed and so on, that is parts of entrepreneurship which which are not capitalists. And I think that in cases, in conjunctures like that, when we have progressive movements demanding for redistribution of wealth and power to the favor of the many and so on, we have also the opposite response by this strata, and the effect in most cases are nationalistic and protective policies, which is exactly what happens in Europe, but also maybe the way that we may interpret Trump. So the root classes play an important role in the shaping of bourgeois strategies. And now we have a conservative, nationalistic, protectionist version of bourgeois strategy, which claims to be a break with the system, anti-systemic and so on, although it's the hardcore of the system.
You have a further 9 minutes if you want to say.
Okay, shall I come now to what I have to say?
Yes.
This was a comment.
There'll be time to respond.
So what I wanted to say is that my main argument is that the return of statist and nationalist policies does not actually mean that neoliberalism is being challenged. Because I see neoliberalism as a form of capitalist governmentality, a form of organizing the power of capital over the working classes and the social majority. It is based on the one hand on austerity, and on the other hand on the crucial regulatory role of the deliberated markets and global finance. The financial sphere is not simply the reign of speculation, a casino. It is much more an overseen mechanism. The level of profitability constitutes a battlefield situation where resistance is being encountered, meaning that the final outcome can never be taken for granted. Techniques of risk management organized within the very mode of functioning of the money markets are a critical point in the management of resistance from labor. Financial markets generate a structure for overseeing the effectiveness of individual capitals, that is to say, a type of supervision of capital movement. The demand for high financial value puts pressure on individual capitals, enterprises, for more intensive and more effective exploitation of labor for higher profitability. This pressure is transmitted through a variety of different channels. To give one example, when a big company is dependent on financial markets for its funding, every suspicion of inadequate valorization increases the cost of funding, reduces the capability that funding will be available, and depresses share and bond prices. Confronted with such a climate, the forces of labor within the politicized environment of the enterprise face the dilemma of deciding whether to accept the employer's unfavorable terms or face the possibility to lose their job, accept the loss of capital, or live with insecurity and unemployment. In this framework, austerity constitutes the cornerstone of neoliberal policies. Austerity reduces labor costs of the private sector, increases profit per labor unit cost, and thereon boosts the profit rate. From this point of view, austerity is a very correct policy for the capitalist class. As regards fiscal consolidation, austerity gives priority to budget cuts over public revenue, reducing taxes on capital and high incomes and downsizing the welfare state. However, what is cost for the capitalist class is the living standard of the working majority of society. It is clear, therefore, that austerity is primarily a class policy. It constantly promotes the interests of capital against those of the workers, professionals, pensioners, unemployed, and economically vulnerable groups. On the long run, it aims at creating a model of labor with fewer rights and less social protection, with low and flexible wages, and the absence of any substantial bargaining power for wage earners. Austerity does lead, of course, to recession or low growth rates. However, a recession puts pressure to every individual entrepreneur, both capitalists and middle bourgeoisie, to reduce all forms of costs, to more intensively follow the path of absolute surplus value, that is, to try to consolidate profit margins through wage cuts, intensification of labor process, infringement of labor regulations and workers' rights, massive redundancies, etc. These strategies are not being challenged by nationalistic slogans like Trump's America First, or by measures of a new protectionism that aim at favoring the capitalist class of one country against that of others. Nationalism does not question neoliberalism as such. It is an attempt to trap labor to the chimera of common national interest. The nation is an inseparable aspect of the capitalist social order. It homogenizes every community within a political territory into national identity. This homogenization effaces the boundaries between the classes, that is, class power and exploitation. At the level of the economy, the nation-state contributes decisively to creating the general material conditions for reproduction of capitalist relations. At the political and ideological cultural level, the state legitimizes the exercise of bourgeoisie political power as national independence and national interest. It is true that these strategic interests of the capitalist class that are being condensed by the state always entail a compromise with the laboring classes. However, these compromises of the ruling classes with the laboring classes are an indispensable condition for the stabilization of capitalism. Any form of class power can reproduce itself only if it achieves to win the consensus or at least the tolerance of the ruled classes. Nationalism is a traditional ideology through which the ruling classes in capitalist social formations ensure their hegemony over the ruled classes. After the consensus on the basis of the so-called national interest is ensured, the ruling classes are ready again to start a new offensive against the social majority. Nationalism is, by virtue of the matter of its historical composition, racist. Since World War II, racism has attained a mainly cultural dimension. People are differentiated on the basis of their so-called specific culture. Devaluation of the foreigner, but also the evaluative dichotomies, European, Asian, Western, Eastern, civilized, barbarian, and etc., flourish on the soil of the latently racist ideology that is very closely interwoven with nationalism. This ideology of the popular nation acquires an aggressive militaristic character in the form of the far right and fascism, but we can trace it also in liberal policies. My conclusion: nationalistic statism and protectionism are fully compatible with neoliberalism. The left has to fight against both. the laboring classes must rebuild their power, creating their own structure of self-organization, governance, and struggle against capital, inevitably within state institutions, but consciously fighting against state power. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you very much to Platypus for organizing this very interesting panel. I think it's a good idea to have it in the life science department. It's very difficult to find the way here, which is also symbolic, given the left in the current crisis. What means left today? I think the bourgeois executive, for example, from the European Union institutions like Juncker and Tusk, they have put it very clear, saying that what we face today is a crisis of the system. I think these bourgeois executives are more accurate in describing the real problem than the debate and the text of the debate, which is mainly focused around the question of a crisis of neoliberalism. I think what we face today is an organic crisis of capitalism, and if you look to the world in reality, there is no neoliberalism and no Keynesianism anymore. If we look, for example, at the policies of President Trump, it's an eclectic mix of measures that only have one idea: to overcome this crisis of the capitalist system and to defend the wealth positions of the ruling class. And this is not only the case with President Trump, but with any politics in the last decades, irrespectively if it's right-wing or social-democratic or whatever, or even the SYRIZA government in Greece. If you look concretely, what is President Trump is proposing to do? He's proposing a vast public investment program in infrastructure, state finance, at the same time cutting the tax of the rich. The next thing, protectionism, which, let us be clear here, will be a very crazy policy because it goes against the organic development of capitalism of the last half a century, and we create big troubles not only in economy but also in diplomacy, war, and so on. And next point, what he already did, a deregulation of the banking sector. So what we have here is a complete mix of politics that come from different economic, bourgeois economic school. And I repeat, the only idea is anything goes to come out of this crisis, anything goes in order to defend the wealth of the rich. So, in fact, there is no economic policy or no ideology in economics policy anymore. At the same time, we should also mention that today we have the highest levels of debts in history of capitalism in peacetime. I mean, in wartime there have been exceptions, but this is true. This is true for state debts, for private debts, and for company debts. Like in Spain, the general level of debts is 500% of GDP, which means that everything what will be produced in the next 5 years is already consumed. This high level of debt is, let's say, the inheritance, or in one sense, inheritance of the so-called neoliberal area, trying to overcome the first signs of the crisis in 2000 with the so-called dot-com boom, to prolong the boom. And since then, this debt was used to finance the wealth position of the bourgeoisie, giving handouts, massive handouts to the banks. And what I describe here in the case of Trump is also the case everywhere else, like in Austria, you have this so-called program A, or what's the name of it? Yes, Plan A. It's the same thing, it's an eclectic mix of measures with the illusion to invest society out of the crisis, less ambitious, less aggressive as Trump policies, because Austria is a very weak imperialism. That's the reason. So I would say the only ideology, and I agree with John here, is left over is racism. Plus, what's interesting, an anti-elite rhetorics used by all these people, and especially by Trump. I think the anti-establishment rhetorics was the most important thing that Trump won this election. And this mixture is necessary to gain, to re-establish, at least temporarily, public support, at least that people go to vote for a lesser evil. Because what is a general feature also in today's capitalism, that people are fed up with politics. I mean, they cannot see any alternative in politics. Politicians are the most hated strata of society. It's a global phenomenon, and there is no trust at all in politics in general. So, yes, what we also can see that what is interesting phenomenon, which we know from history, that capital is losing control over its political personnel, and that there are splits in the ruling class everywhere. It was manifested twice in two important countries in the last year, which is the Brexit and the presidency of Trump, which expresses that the ruling classes of this country have lost control over the political processes to a minority part of their bourgeoisie, which is who are doing crazy politics of the point of view of the general stability of the capitalist system. And we should not forget, especially this year, when we celebrate the 100 years of the October Revolution, that split in the ruling class is a precondition for a revolution, which in these days can only be a proletarian revolution. I think that the fundamental reason for all these processes is the impossibility of capitalism to develop its productive forces. And this is a phenomenon, is a global phenomenon today. 2-3 years ago we could have quoted the BRIC nations, but this is finished. It's a global phenomenon. World trade is stagnating into the reverse, and this is the fundamental reason for all these political processes taking place, and for the non-politics we can see everywhere. This is combined with the growing inequality, with the stagnant real income or a loss of real income of the working class, of the working classes of the world, a negative saving rates for working class households, saving rates for working class households, an endemic unemployment and poverty, and general a feel of loss of control over life and security as a phenomenon crippling all societies of the world. And all this is a finished receipt for class struggle and for revolution. Am I? 1 minute, no problem. Just to touch upon perspective, I think we have to be clear. Despite all this mix of economy, there is no economic policies, there is no objective possibility for capitalists to overcome this crisis. Crisis in the system is a feature of the epoch. And just to a last idea, I was a bit staggering about the text, and I had to read it, I have to admit, like 10 times to get it used. And I'm quite a political person, but I think there's a fundamental problem with how the question is posed here, which is to try to understand what's happening now through books, through terms derived of political discourse, which was based on a complete different historical period of capitalism than we have today. And I think in order for the left wing to get into the gear, we have to look at the real process. And I don't want to miss out what's the general orientation and the program. I think we have to look and orientate towards the elementary outburst of anger of the masses, as we have seen in Athens, and which was the case 100 years ago in the Russian Revolution. And I think our program should be exactly the same. The only program worth struggling for is the expropriation of the bourgeoisie, and given the technological level and the cultural level of today's society, the first thing a workers' government should do is to reduce working time to a necessary minimum level, which is 10-15 hours a week, so that people are free to develop and organize human society in a harmonic way.
Thank you.
Okay, a lot was already said, but I'll have to begin from the beginning, because when I read all this liberal left, or left liberal American discussions about Trump, is just full of crying and full of horror. Well, everything is like the world is collapsing, everything is terrible, Trump is terrible, and so on and so on. Great. Okay. Where is the analysis? I'm sure, by the way, everything is terrible, not just Trump. That's exactly the point. Life is terrible in a way. But the question is, where is the analysis? Where is the analysis? And what is missing? I'm not even speaking about emotion, but two basic things are absolutely missing from that kind of debate. And first thing, which is, I think, missing both in the liberal discourse, neoliberal discourse, mainstream liberal, left-wing liberal discourse, but also in some radical leftist discourse, is the understanding of the irreversibility of the crisis of neoliberalism. It is falling apart. But here we have to be very careful. Unfortunately, at this stage, we can only say that neoliberalism is falling apart. It doesn't automatically mean that capitalism is falling apart. Because capitalism changed its form quite a few times through similar crises. And so the important thing about neoliberalism is to understand that it was really pursuing the policy of class revenge over the working class. It really defeated labor, but defeating labor, well, really defeating labor, it destroyed global demand. And thus undermined the most basic conditions for the reproduction of capitalist global economy. So that's unless they get out of this vicious circle, neoliberal system cannot be retained, and it will not be retained, which doesn't mean that capitalism is not capable of getting elsewhere. But here we have an open stage of development where there are different possibilities and also certain windows of opportunity for the left, including the red left. Okay, so then the other point. So the first point is the irreversibility of crisis, and I stress again, it's a spontaneous decomposition of the system which is taking place, with Trump or without Trump. So in that sense, Trump is a political reflection of the spontaneous economic and social process. Of course, politics very often is something which is going behind the economic development. And I think Chris made a very strong point comparing that with the crisis of the 70s. I think it's a very similar effort. But the second aspect here is that, ironically, with no matter how much reference is given to the word class, including, especially I love it when in America they write about white working class. So the main characteristic of these people is that they're white, not that they're working class. And by the way, when they're speaking about black people or African Americans, they never characterize their social class, as if it's just one group of people. Black entrepreneurs, black workers, unemployed blacks, it's the same thing, no difference. Okay, so anyhow, class is missing from this picture. So let's look at class interests. And here we see two different types of class interests, which explain, according to me, Trump phenomenon. Because on the one hand, there is a really deep division within bourgeoisie. And everybody knows, yes, there is a division within bourgeoisie. What's the meaning of this division? It's not that some people are homophobic and others are not. Not at all. It's about something else. You see, Trump and his entourage, of course they're extremely rich people, but with all their $2, $3, $4 billion, are they so big really in the context of modern capitalism? Compared to transnational companies, they're medium-level bourgeoisie actually. This is this faction of bourgeoisie which is oriented towards domestic production and domestic markets, which actually suffered under neoliberalism. Of course, for us, their sufferings would be a little bit funny. But still, I think they see that as a problem. They see that as their suffering and their oppressed. So they were kind of oppressed by the transnational capital. And this is a rebellion of this domestic bourgeoisie against transnational capital. And then we see the other side of it, and the other side of it is that there is a rebellion of workers, a rebellion of the Tory classes, petty bourgeois sections of the population, workers, unemployed people, a very broad spectrum of low classes, not just working class. But the important thing here is that there is a real coincidence that, ironically, this domestic bourgeoisie and workers are interested in one thing, which is in common. And this one thing is to get higher wages to increase demand. So for the domestic bourgeoisie, higher wages of workers means that there will be more consumers for their products. For workers, higher wages means that they will have higher wages, period. And here you have the real common interest, though this common interest stops exactly here. That's the beginning and that's the end. And again, of course, liberals and neoliberals are saying that, for example, protectionism will not work. But it's very interesting when I hear leftists saying that. It's very strange because the left very often take neoliberal and liberal arguments at face value. Every time when any government, anywhere in the world, practice protectionism, all liberal economists immediately said it's not going to work. And then it worked. Time and again, time and again. And that's the point. Protectionism is no end for capitalism. That's the important point we have to understand. It's not about the end of capitalism. But it is a very important transformation of capitalism, also including the logic of class relations within capitalism. And by the way, this is the situation which can be potentially much more favorable for the working class in terms of developing its own structures, organizations, and powers to fight back for, at least economically, for higher wages, but then also politically, for higher influence in the society. However, because I said, it's a strange combination of working class protest and bourgeois protest within capitalism, which leads also to tremendous contradictions. Everybody said today that Trump's policies are full of contradictions. Contradictions are everywhere. And of course, when you listen to some, not only words of Trump's, but also when you listen to some of his decisions which are already made, they seem as if being prepared by some people from Seattle who protested in 1999. And then all of a sudden you have the same person announcing decisions which are totally hostile to everything these protesters would fight for. So, on the one hand, you have his educational policies, on the other hand, you have his almost anti-globalization kind of policies. Why? But that simply reflects the class contradiction within this coalition. And by the way, it also explains the situation of Bernie Sanders. Because he goes and denounces Trump, and the next day he goes and says, well, look, the decision of Trump on NAFTA is not so bad after all, right? And by the way, actually it is so. But the point is that this is exactly where the real perspective of class struggle emerges. Because it is very clear that Trump project will fall apart. It will fall apart not because of the protests of the liberals. It will fall apart because of the internal contradictions, not only within Trump's package of policies, but within the class coalition which brought him to power in the White House, and it is going to disintegrate sooner or later. Unless Trump suddenly changes sides, like becoming a working class hero, for example, which is hardly imaginable. Though nobody knows what can happen to that kind of character. But anyhow, it is absolutely clear that a huge crisis is going to erupt, exactly because this composition of forces is not going to last for too long. Sooner or later, in one way or another, it's going to decompose. But here, I'm coming to the last point. What is to be done? A big question for the left, because at this point, what happens is that a considerable part of US left, I hate to say, is actually playing a role of foot soldiers for neoliberals. They're just totally lacking their own initiative, their own agenda, and they're just being used and manipulated for the purpose which has nothing to do with anything progressive, with any progressive agenda, which is not even formulated. It's very important. No progressive agenda is formulated. And after this tremendous rebellion of Bernie Sanders' campaign, what we see now is that most of the liberal left, and maybe most of the left in the United States, is acting as if they have no agenda of their own, just following the agendas which are kind of developed by the defeated section of bourgeoisie. And this is a road nowhere. So the answer is, of course, not to support Trump, even when he does or says some good things. By the way, we have to be honest and say, okay, these things are not so bad for working people, but still doesn't mean that we have to be Trump defenders. No, of course not. Given the composition of forces, he's no working class hero, no. And still, it is absolutely essential to dissociate the left and leftist critique of Trump from the liberal attacks of Trump, and not to be part of that attack. And it's more important that while liberals or neoliberals attack Trump for trying to change something, what we have to say is that the bad thing about Trump is exactly that he's not changing things. The bad aspect of Trump is that we see the continuation of the same, quite a lot of continuation of the same policy. So the bad thing about Trump is not that he's some kind of reversal or change vis-a-vis Obama administration, but that in many ways he is the continuation of Obama administration, just including this famous Muslim ban, which was actually proposed and prepared under the previous administration. So the worst aspects of Trump's policy are exactly the policies of liberals, which now liberals themselves are denouncing for one reason, that they cannot carry out these policies themselves. So political independence and organizational independence, that's the answer for good leftist politics. It was the answer, and it is the answer, it will be always the answer. Without political independence, there will be no social change, there will be no successful social reform, and there will be no revolution. Thank you.
I'm going to ask the panelists to respond to each other for a couple of minutes before opening up. I suppose that one thing that's come out a little bit is about this question of change, continuity and change within capitalism. In terms of your different approaches to that question. We could have had other perspectives on the panel that might have, say, defended the EU and sought for kind of reforms in some way of neoliberalism within the EU. But we don't have that. But what I think that there seems to be some interesting changes here, or differences here in terms of how one conceives of a continuity and change within capitalism, and whether the character of, possibly was neoliberalism a continuity of the kind of welfare state era, or in some ways in the state's administration of that, of neoliberalism, versus are we over neoliberalism? Is this a continuation of neoliberalism? And furthermore, does that affect the kind of political prospects to the left? Do you conceive of the different character of those? And what role does the left play in these different conjunctural moments of continuity and change in capitalism?
Right. One thing that I wanted to respond to that I think is really kind of a common theme among all the speakers, including something that I was trying to take up, is the question of, what works, what doesn't work in capitalism. And I chose to emphasize neoliberalism as a political crisis right now with respect to the Trump phenomenon, and set aside whether or not Trump is really responsive to the economic problem. Now I find myself wanting to, in a sense, flip it over the other way and remind us that Fordist capital, Keynesian Fordism, experienced a crisis in the late 60s and early 70s. In other words, a low-profit, high-wage, full employment regime, which was not really nationalist, it was an international system of capital, experienced a crisis. Now, that crisis, the economic crisis of the late 60s and early 70s, was not identical with, but it did historically coincide with, the crisis of the New Deal coalition. And in many respects, the crisis of the New Deal coalition in the United States was the product of growth. In other words, the proletarianization of the Black South, but also the migration of Black workers to the North, is what facilitated, didn't cause or determine necessarily, but it certainly facilitated the abandoning of Jim Crow and the Civil Rights Movement. So I think that we have to articulate and not simply try to determine the relationship between economics and politics. In other words, you could say that already the Reaganite coalition was showing some signs of stress under George W. Bush, for instance, right? And there was never an easy alliance between, it was always an uneasy alliance between the neoconservatives and the neoliberals, and frankly, between the neoliberals and the Christian fundamentalists, or even between the Christian fundamentalists and the neoconservatives. So there's, there was a lot of, and I'm also emphasizing the matter of ideology, because I think that when we talk about consensus or coalitions that were built, they were built at a concrete, practical level, but they were also they were plausible at a broader ideological level. In other words, they made sense to people in terms of their experience of capitalism. So it is a little bit of a broader question of whether economic policies work or don't work. They can seem to work. Reagan was a response to the downturn of the 1970s, but that hardly means that Reaganomics works. Right? What worked, very simply, was the electoral coalition that got Reagan elected and re-elected, and that got George Herbert Walker Bush, George W. Bush's father, elected in 1988. Trump doesn't have to do anything except get re-elected. Right? So on the one hand, in other words, he doesn't need necessarily the support of any particular section of the ruling class. He doesn't. He clearly doesn't have it, and he may not get it. But he can get votes. And so that's why I would sort of push back on the question of, will this work? What are the contradictions in the policy? He's sort of particularly well suited to, do whatever works, but we have to keep in mind what it is that has to work. Namely, he has to get reelected. Now that will have consequences. In other words, the way the parties manage their electoral coalitions, the way they articulate consensus, this kind of thing, will affect the shape of capitalism. Will certainly affect the shape of capitalism. But not necessarily just as intended. Right? In other words, a kind of nationalistic call of make America great again, which because the United States is the United States and not just any country, doesn't quite mean nationalism necessarily. Because after all, he did send Rudy Giuliani down to Mexico and had make Mexico great again also. And he's also claimed that better trade policy with China will be better for the Chinese as well. Maybe I put too much on the table, but I at least wanted to remind us that the crisis of the 1970s, it was economic and political, but they weren't necessarily the same thing, although they fed into each other.
I think that we must differentiate between the crisis of neoliberalism and the idea that because of the crisis of neoliberalism is falling apart. I disagree on this point. And I don't think that a proper argument to evaluate if neoliberalism is falling apart or not is to think from the perspective of effective demand and say that capitalism needs the effective demand in order to be strong, to have high growth rates and so on. Because it is as if we say to the capitalists to come here in this room, open a bag with money, 500 euros, and distribute 1 or 2 500 euros to all of us in order to buy their products. But this is not going to happen ever. Marx says in a passage that every capital, in the second volume of Capital, that every capitalist is keen to have the workers of all other capitalists with a very high purchasing power so that they buy their products, but his own workers must have low wages, because low wages means high profits. This is, of course, a contradiction. But if we don't have a labor movement to achieve higher wages, this is not going to happen, because every capitalist thinks first of himself or of herself. That is, to keep low wages in order to have high profits. For the capitalist class, the level of wages in the welfare state is costs. And all capitalists who speak about lowering the labor costs. And if we look into the history of capitalism, all crises have been overcome through a very strict strategy of austerity, which didn't bear the name of austerity, but if we read Capital, the first volume, we will see that during the crisis of 1870, there were 5 to 7 deaths out of hunger in London. What nowadays takes place in Bombay, in what's the name now? Mumbai, yes, in Mumbai, or in other parts of the very poor capitalist world. So we cannot expect that the ruling class itself is going to change course, and I think that if we see the only exception, that is what happened in the United States with the New Deal, or in Germany during the 30s. It happened in Germany during the 30s. Or in Sweden, we will see that there were other factors which had to do with the labor movement which led to this situation. And a very short comment on the productive forces problematic. I think that, of course, Marx refers to the development of the productive forces, but in his whole work, it's more important the thesis that the history up to now is mainly the history of class struggles, so to focus more on class struggle in order to interpret the crisis of capitalism and the crisis of neoliberalism, and less on the technical aspect of you, or to take it less as a technical aspect and more as a social aspect, as an aspect of class and power.
Okay, thanks for your advice. I also will give back some advices. I mean, I'm not astonished, but there seems to be a common agreement that there is a crisis of neoliberalism, but it's not falling apart. I think, well, I have to insist, I do not agree with this thesis. Because I insist, there's a crisis of capitalism in general, not of one ideology of capitalism. And where is neoliberalism today? I just want to re-quote. We are at the verge of new protectionism on a global level, trade war. We have the highest level of debt as the result of the neoliberalism. It goes completely against the ideology. So I simply cannot see this neoliberal problem. And for me, and I think we have to be concrete, because this is a theoretical discussion, and we have to be clear. Because if we debate like this, we come to the conclusion another capitalism is possible. This is the result of this debate, if we insist. And I insist there is not a possibility for another capitalism. And I try to argue with it through the politics of the capitalists themselves, who use any measure to defend their wealth and to make capitalism running. And I think we should talk on the concrete. What do we have in Greece? Or what did we have? Did we have a crisis of neoliberalism or a crisis of capitalism that dragged down society in the abyss. It's not the ideological problem, and the idea of the SYRIZA government to re-establish a different kind of capitalism in Greece led to complete defeat of the working class. Despite a huge popular movement, 60% of the people saying, "Ochi, no." And what's the result? The result is the worst defeat of the Greek working class in democratic times, because the leadership had the idea of a transformed anti-neoliberal capitalism. So it's not a theoretical debate, it's a debate that's important to class struggle. What phenomenon do we have and how do we fight it? With which program? Just to give a short overview on the development of capitalism. Boris said capitalism always transformed itself. It's true. Everything that lives transforms constantly. Everything. I mean, it's true. But how does it transform? And I insist, we have entered a new epoch of capitalist development. And to look at the long waves, there was John was picking up on it. The first big generalized crisis of capitalism starting in Vienna in 1873. 5 years of crisis, then a long upswing, which marked the entering of capitalism into the period of imperialism, which ultimately led to the First World War as the solution of the contradictions which were built up in this long period of capitalist upswing. Then we have the October Revolution and an unclear situation between the imperialist powers, which leads to a period of instability in world capitalism and world relations, which is the interwar period, which then leads to the Second World War, which makes the question clear, what the First World War could not do. And then we have a very special thing. The end of the Second World War meant a strengthening of the planned economy of the Stalinist Soviet Union type, and on the other hand, a strengthening of Western capitalism. And this was the political debate, peaceful coexistence, as it was called in Moscow, was a debate, a political decision for a base for a long-term capitalist upswing, which ended in 73-74, the first generalized crisis of capitalism in the Second World, in the period of Second World War. And then we have new phenomena. Yes, then we have the attack of the bourgeoisie expressed in Thatcher and Reagan to increase the rate of profit of their national bourgeoisies. And the clampdown on the miners in Britain, on the Fluvials, yes.
Air traffic controllers.
Yeah, they have traffic controllers. So, then a new political phenomenon, the collapse and the counter-revolution in the Soviet Union. The opening of China to the market, the opening of India to the market. In the end of 89, 1 billion of people are reintroduced into capitalist world market, which helps to prolong a system in crisis. This ends in 2000. This is consumed in 2000, and from 2000 onwards, a huge explosion of all kinds of debt in order to keep economy running. And 2008 is finished. Everything is finished. It's consumed. The credits are consumed. The integration of China in world market is consumed. And what we have now is an organic crisis of capitalism where there is no way out. And the left wing has to adopt a scientific program to overcome it by its own means. And the only thing as a left-winger to struggle for is the expropriation of the bourgeoisie. That's it. There is no other capitalism possible. It's unworthy to try to fight for it.
Well, I may probably say something which will not be very popular with everyone here, but I think that another capitalism is definitely possible. The big question is whether we like it or not. I think in many ways it could be much worse than the current form. It is possible, and it's going to be one of the options. It's going to be much worse than the kind of capitalism we have now. That's one of the options we have to consider very, very seriously. And in that sense, I think Rosa Luxemburg was exactly correct, speaking about socialism and barbarism. And the point is that barbarism won, and it's winning, and it will be winning probably time and again, mainly because of us. Because we never posed a proper alternative. But alternative is not just like saying we want to expropriate capitalist simplification. Exactly, we do want. No doubt about it. I cannot imagine a socialist or a communist who is not in favor of expropriation of bourgeoisie. I mean, period. That's, if it is not on the agenda, I mean, at least as a goal, well, then you are not a socialist. That's clear. But politics is about very concrete steps. And there is a whole strategy of concrete political steps which have to be designed and made practical. So that's just repeating our general slogans and general principles will not be enough to confront the kind of disaster the world is facing now. So that's one point I wanted to make in probably a bit more emotionally. But okay, now speaking about whether this decomposition is really a decomposition or whether it is just a crisis of the system. Of course, it is very clear that without social and political events, the system doesn't change. But it only means that these events in many ways reflect the tendencies which are generated by the economic development and the objective economic contradictions. And when these economic contradictions become irreversible, we also have specific events. Like, for example, the split of the ruling class. When we speak about the split of the ruling class, or ruling coalitions, or not just ruling class coalitions, but broader political and social coalitions, which makes this system stable for a while, and they disintegrate. What does it mean? It only means that on the social and political level, this very same decomposition is just taking place, and that's it. And by the way, we'll speak about the first volume of Capital and the other volumes as well, by the way. Because it's very interesting, most leftists do not read Capital beyond the first volume. This is another interesting phenomenon. I can hardly find many, except for some professional economists. Most leftists do not read beyond the first volume, which I really think is a really big problem. But anyhow, Marx mentioned so-called political economy of the working class. This is what John actually referred to. When he said that, okay, political economy of the working class is that, it's exactly this paradox, that every single capitalist wants higher wages for the workers of the others, capitalists, and doesn't want high wages for his workers. So the way to overcome that, according to Marx, is exactly what he called political economy of the working class, which is workers' organization and political action through the state. This is very important. So in that sense, working class forces capitalist state to discipline capitalists, to make them all follow particular rules. It's also the first volume, it's the discussion of English industrial inspectors. English industrial inspectors. That's the whole paragraph. It's very strange how much time and how much space Marx devotes to that minor episode in the history of English capitalism, but it's very important because it was the way that there was political pressure put on the capitalist class through the state, through this industrial inspection, to improve living conditions, working conditions, and wages. So, but here we are coming to one very interesting and very serious problem. Ironically, these successes of labor movement very often strengthen capitalism. not weaken it. Workers win economic struggles. They win battles, including political battles, social democracy. They win. What's the outcome? Capitalism resolved its crisis. Capitalism changed its model and resolved the crisis of demand. And doesn't mean we have to drop economic struggles. No, it just only has a meaning that we have to be honest to ourselves. We have to understand the contradictions, not only of capitalism, but also contradictions of our own activities and our own politics. And finally, by the way, speaking about protectionism as part of that package, I should mention one very important thing. It's now we're speaking about the anniversary of 1917, but it's absolutely essential that Russia was between 1890 and 1913. Russia was one of the most protectionist capitalist economy of the world. That's very well reflected in the works of Mikhail Khodorkovsky. That very protection contributed massively to the formation of the revolutionary working class in Russia and contributed to the formation of the Bolshevik Party. So I was speaking about labor movement in its successes contributing to the success of capitalism. But here I'm attributing one of the preconditions of the success of the revolution, ironically, to the success of capitalism. So that's the other side of the same dialectic. So it means that we have to keep on fighting, but with open eyes. We have to understand that everything is contradiction. It doesn't mean we have to give up. It only means that we have to face the contradictions, face the consequences, and the problems which we are creating to ourselves and to our own movement, even through our own success, when there is a success, of course.
Thank you. So we've got about an hour for the Q&A, which is great. And just to let everyone know, so I'm going to take one question at a time and ask people to respond, so that we don't miss out answers to any questions. But please indicate clearly. There was some controversy that we have not seen people, non-Platypus members, ask questions yesterday. So I want to make it clear, if you want to ask a question, you're very welcome, and I will try and fit you in. I've seen a couple of people indicate already. Is there anyone else at the back there, just in case? Keep it in mind. Okay, so Pam, would you like one? Okay.
So it seems like there's this emphasis on whether it be continuity or discontinuity, whether it be a kind of the political order, the politics of the bourgeoisie don't really matter, which, sorry, your IMT comrade, I forget your name, you seem to say there's no ideology now in economic policy, so this is all the same. What I hear you saying is that the splits in the ruling class, they don't really matter because they're just the expression of rackets, and so we don't really need to pay attention to bourgeois politics because I'm not sure, because crisis plus transitional program equals revolution. Meaning, I'm not quite sure, like, how is it that without an understanding of bourgeois politics at the state level, you know, the American state specifically, would we be ready to, as Boris says, our eyes open to advance the political struggle? Is this just do we already know, or are you saying that, I'm not sure. So then I would just raise it for the panel, like, what is different? What is the political difference, I guess, in Trump? Because some of you guys said there isn't one. Like, there isn't any political difference, doesn't matter. So if there is a difference, could you say, what is the difference? If there is no difference, could you say, how is it that it's just the same? And does it matter?
I'll ask Emmanuel to respond to that.
Yes, thank you, comrade. This is a very good question. It helps me to clarify. I never said that it does not matter. In fact, it matters a lot because it's reflecting an objective process. And I already pointed it out. But to make it more clear now, what we can see now is that capital is losing its control about the political process, and this matters a lot because objectively this is a precondition for revolution, a split in the ruling class, and we have seen it clearly with Trump, who is not the candidate of Wall Street, even if he's a rich guy, but he is a mad man, basically, not reflecting the general interest of the ruling class of the United States. We could see it with the Brexit, which is against the city of London, and this is against the interest of the city of London, and this is a very important thing. And in itself, how did this Brexit start? It was a conflict in the Tory party, and yet alone that the Tory party puts onto a public vote a wider question for British capitalism is reflecting in itself a process of going down of the British bourgeoisie, because the British bourgeoisie would normally not put on vote such a wide issue. So they are losing control of the political process, and this is important. And if you look to history, for example, the debate of Marx and Engels on the Kargalitzky, on the corn laws, the question on protectionism. This was also a conflict within the ruling class, where Marx and Engels used these splits, or they advocated to use these splits in order to advance the issues, to advance the social issue of the working class, but without taking either side in the conflict. And so, the same with the European Union. For example, there is clearly this project of deglobalization, which is a fact today, will inevitably lead to breaks in the European Union, which objectively is reflecting a crisis of the system. So what program should we adopt? I think we have not a general idea on this, but it depends who breaks, on which terms. For example, a break of Greece with the institution of the European Union, based on a popular vote, the OCHI, against the dictatorship, would have been an absolutely progressive thing, and could have initiated a process of heavy social struggles, class struggle, and even revolution in Greece and beyond in all Europe. But what we have now is it was consolidated through wrong policies, this situation. So yes, it's interesting, and I finish with that. I agree with what has been said in the invitation here. It's interesting that politics comes back through right-wing bourgeois politicians, and not through the working class, not through the left wing, which in my opinion is not the fault of the working class, but of the wrong program and the reformist program of the working class.
Okay. Well, the first general conclusion is that capitalism will not fall apart unless we overthrow it.
It's true.
Okay. And I want to remind you, with that, without any other comments, that Lenin wrote, put the subtitle to his book Imperialism, the latest phase of capitalism, more than 100 years ago. And the question is, a latest state of capitalism, how many 100 years is going to last? We already have more than 100 years. Are we going to wait another 100 years, another 300 years? This latest phase. Okay. Now, the split in the ruling class. I think that this is a reality, or a part of the reality. But, however, what is very dangerous is the following: that a split in the ruling class and in ruling class policies means that there are different programs of hegemony over the ruled classes. That is, on the one hand, Trump deviates from mainstream policies in certain aspects. On the other hand, in this deviation, he creates a consensus with part of the ruling classes, of the ruled classes. That is small bourgeoisie, petty bourgeoisie, or even parts of the working class. And this is a stabilization process of capitalism. Even if we have different class strategies within the ruling classes, if each one of it creates a consensus with part of the ruled classes, then this class within the bourgeois camp is at the same time stabilizing in a way. And so let me talk about Greece. The main idea of the leading apparatus of SYRIZA since the second half of 2013 was that austerity was a wrong policy, a false policy, propagated, put forward by idiots. But it's not that.
The idiots won.
The idiots won because it was a correct policy for capital to reduce, to disorganize the working class, to through austerity to create conflicts within the working class, the ones who have higher wages as compared to the ones who are on a very precarious working condition, and so on and so on. There were different strata within the working class, the one opposing the other, and on the other hand, to tame the working class in a condition of precarious work, of low income, and so on. This was a strategy, it was not a wrong policy. So SYRIZA was saying that the ruling classes follow a wrong policy because Germany is one-sided or has trade surpluses and wants to protect the trade surpluses, and the whole issue was a conflict between Greece and Germany, which is bullshit, because the ruling classes of Greece and 40% of the population who followed them out of fear or out of interest were in favor of austerity, as we saw in the referendum. They were a minority, but they were 40%, and they were the strong minority of the country. They were all those who had the money, the positions in the state apparatus, the mass media, and so on. So it was this strong part of the society, and the leadership of SYRIZA was with one foot in one boat, and with the other foot on the other boat, and what connected both boats? Growth, development. And they were talking about development and growth, and not about the class interests of the working class. So they were determined to fail, or not to fail, to be the same as the others. And this was clear since early 2014, and that's why I stayed out of the last elections, declaring that I do not want to be part of the coming government of the parliamentary group of SYRIZA, because it was clear what was going to happen. And this happened on the 20th of February, not in July, when they signed the first agreement. It was absolutely clear. So, I think that the same is true with Brexit. We had a big tradition in Britain of the Conservative Party, as you correctly said, who were in favor of the Brexit. I remember the book of Connolly in the 70s or early 80s, which was a prominent member of the Tory party, The Rotten Heart of Europe. and also some others who were Tory members, MPs, who were talking about national independence and saying that Europe has deprived Britain of its national independence and that the only solution would be if the Queen resigns. Then there was going to be a problem, a constitutional problem, and this would cause a referendum for Brexit and so on. So they had a tradition in the country, but this split of the ruling class was also creating two different bourgeoisie consensus strategies. One last sentence, the result, according to my opinion, is to stick in all cases with labor interests. In all cases. That is to follow a revolutionary path in the state, of course, but against the state and against the mainstream policies of the one or of the other kind.
Question.
Okay, so I have my list now, Yesha.
So I basically have a quick question, which concerns I mean, if you want, there's like that classical sort of term between the relation of base and superstructure, because I feel like that maybe a not so clear point, but a point of contention on the panel is, on the one hand, what meaning do we give to bourgeois politics? So what's happening? I mean, Chris talked a lot about what's happening in the Democratic Party, in the Republican Party, the sort of arrangements on the level of what probably classical Marxism would call superstructure. And on the other hand, Boris, you said that you kind of trace those developments and what happens under Trump as this sort of expression of very, let's say, hard material contradictions in the setup of capital interests, class interests. And I guess the other two are also kind of addressing it somewhere in between. So to kind of pose this maybe to abstract questions, but maybe you can kind of shed more light onto it. What is this sort of complicated and twofold relationship between base and superstructure? How can we make sense of what's happening on a political scale with respect to what's happening on the in the economy and vice versa?
Chris indicate the
One thing, not to get particularly Marxological or romantic, but the issue is not the relationship of the base and superstructure. The issue is the contradiction of base and superstructure. In other words, the fact that we would even distinguish between base and superstructure is itself a phenomenon of the contradiction of capitalism as far as Marx is concerned. And I think this came up earlier about lagging behind. I think Boris raised this. Namely, that not only is there a contradiction between base and superstructure, but the superstructure lags behind the base. In other words, there's a temporal contradiction. There's not just a sociological or economic or spatial contradiction, there's a temporal contradiction in the process of capitalism reproducing itself. And of course, capitalism doesn't really reproduce itself. What's reproduced is the contradiction. In other words, what's reproduced is the crisis. I think that Emmanuel, you sort of gave a long account of how capitalism has kicked the can down the road, basically for 150 years, from the 1870s all the way to the present, and that finally maybe they can't kick the can down the road anymore because they've tried every strategy and they've run out of strategies. I like Boris, I think, well, they don't necessarily need a strategy. I think that capitalism reproduces itself because people are desperate enough to want a job, and new forms of employment will be created, and therefore the new valorization process of capital will come into being. With respect to base and superstructure, I invoke David Harvey. So Harvey points out that Ford came up with this idea: cheap cars, high wages. Also, though, a disciplined workforce. and a workforce that lived austerely, but he wanted them to be able to buy cars. He wanted them to be able to buy his cars, as well as cars of his competitors, but his cars, and he wanted them to live frugally, so that they could, not waste money on alcohol, but take their high wages and buy cars. But that strategy was actually formulated much earlier than it became adopted as a regime of accumulation in capital. In some ways, you could say that it wasn't really adopted until after World War II. It's not really adopted as a function of the New Deal. Similarly, John Maynard Keynes. So his view of capitalism is formulated in the pre-World War I world, but it only finds an opportunity in the Great Depression to really be implemented. So there's a lag there as well. And you can say, well, these strategies were ahead of the curve, but only in retrospect. In other words, now we say, oh, we'll see, Ford knew that you have to raise the demand for working class and raise their wages, etc. And Keynes knew that the only variable in capital is working class demand as an economic function. That basically ruling class, like capitalist investment, is pretty constant, and the only variable, the only thing you can do anything about, is working class demand. But again, the fact that these strategies are able to achieve any kind of purchase, I would say that we have to treat with skepticism the idea that Fordism and Keynesianism ever really worked. Right? So, it's a long-standing controversy. What saved capitalism from the Great Depression? Was it the New Deal? Was it Fordism and Keynesianism? Or was it the massive destruction of World War II that then created an opportunity for rebuilding capitalism on a global scale, right? So I just want to kind of keep those sorts of questions in mind when we talk about base and superstructure. Because first of all, we're not talking about like determining, it's not Althusser, right? We can sort of keep Althusser safely sequestered somewhere else about, the superstructure being determined by the base in the final instant or whatever. No, with Marx, it's the contradiction of base and superstructure. And also, more specifically, it's the contradiction of the superstructure as bourgeois social relations versus the economic base, the industrial forces. And there is no politics of the industrial forces of production. In other words, for Marx, the industrial forces of production are pure potential. The only politics is the politics of bourgeois social relations, whether it's of capital or of labor. All of those, labor is still bourgeois social relations. So superstructure is in contradiction with the base, it lags behind, and it encompasses all of politics. In other words, Marxian socialism is also a product of the kind of thought of bourgeois social relations. It comes out of political economy, it comes out of labor as value, it comes out of a society of work, it comes out of all those things. So it's also important to keep in mind that whatever we might say about Trump in terms of protectionism, nationalism, racism, whatever else, he's just an arch-bourgeois kind of character who walks around with a sort of, Cliff Notes version of Adam Smith or something, and maybe with some like addenda from Keynes or something. Like he just has some kind of strange, quaint mid-20th century common sense capitalism. And then he claims that he never really liked hanging out with other rich people, that he always got along with working class people better or something. And he liked hanging around the job site when he was a kid at his father's construction firm. So superstructure, right, if we say superstructure and base, we're talking about, for instance, so we talked about Greece, and that's been an item of controversy between Emmanuel and John here, a little bit in terms of, okay, what was the opportunity? Well, at the end of the day, of course, the issue was, I think that, are we just trying to find a strategy of putting Greeks back to work? Right? Is that, so Angela Merkel can say, boost the tourism industry, or what, find some way, and the problem is that there's too much corruption, and the problem is that Greeks don't want to work, and blah, 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 blah. So that's what we're really talking about at the level of conflict. We're talking about conflict over the bourgeois superstructure, the bourgeois social relations and the superstructure, and how they ideologically make sense. right? Sometimes the bourgeois superstructure, it makes sense to say, yes, we want to put everyone to work and we want, the economy to be going. And sometimes it makes sense to say, social Darwinism, sink or swim, there are winners and losers, whatever, right? And that's where it's hashed out. It's never really hashed out at the level of, okay, what's going on in the base? Because the base is just pure potential. As long as we have capitalism, we never see the real potential that could be achieved with socialism out of the industrial forces of production. That is never really there. It's only there in very obscure, perverse, and self-contradictory form in what is otherwise a bourgeois world.
Boris?
Yeah. Well, speaking about base superstructure, I personally think that in Marx's text, it was more like a metaphor. So it shouldn't be taken too literally. Because I was raised in the Soviet Union with all these endless debates about which particular element belongs to base or superstructure. And then I started reading the original text and I thought, wait a minute. It's more like a very general description where Marx just wants his readers to understand his idea properly so he can give this metaphor, period. Which doesn't mean that Marxism doesn't understand that or doesn't have this emphasis on the priority of production relations of production. Yeah, that's for sure. But here, and exactly, I agree, and then relations of production produce social relations. That's the process. Eh? But here we're coming to the political question, because of course the debate here is political. And you see there is also a dialectic between economic development and class struggle. This is essential. So different aspects of economic development create different dynamics and different opportunities for class struggle. In that sense, on the one hand, it would be very simple to say, well, actually, if you're looking at the history of capitalism, you definitely see cycles of free trade and cycles of protectionism. Cycles of globalization and cycles of deglobalization. So in that sense, it can be very fatalistic, mechanistic, deterministic, whatever. Saying, okay, now we are in the cycle of deglobalization and game, right? Period. Stop. No. It only means that because we are in the cycle, the dynamics and the possibilities of social and class struggle, including political action, are different compared to the previous period. And I think that this is exactly the exciting period when there are new opportunities. By the way, yesterday there was this very pessimistic debate about critical theory. And I think, well, now, even though the so-called subject, the so-called proletariat, so-called working class, in many ways is much weaker structurally than it used to be, even though in terms of numbers there are now more people on wage labor, who work for wages than anywhere, than any time in the world history. But this wage labor now, in structural terms, probably is weaker than any time in previous history. Also disorganized, ideologically demoralized, split along the lines of race, ethnicity, split into geographic divisions and so on and so on. Still, well, the recomposition of capitalism through its crisis, which is happening now, which is taking place now, is also creating the tremendous opportunity for the recomposition of the working class and the recomposition of the left and the movement. So that's we can miss this opportunity or use this opportunity. And by the way, look, Ohi was a tremendous missed opportunity, not for Greece only, but for Europe. Because the consequence of Ohi was that when SYRIZA turned right and returned to the neoliberal kind of policies, was that the opportunities which were opened by the crisis of the European Union were not used by the left on the European level, but were used by the right. So that had a tremendous political consequence, and in that sense, inconsistency of failures and weaknesses of the left have tremendous effect on the life of people. So in that sense, we are bearing tremendous responsibility.
Okay, so I now have Nadia.
Thanks. I just wanted to ask a question about a point of agreement that seems to be happening, about how something that the left is aligning at the moment is class struggle. So for Marx, the bourgeoisie was only a class in itself and for itself, and its struggle against the proletariat. And the proletariat was only a class in itself and for itself, and its struggle against the bourgeoisie. And of course, the proletariat was a class whose task was unique in world history, since its task was the abolition of class itself. Today, when there is no proletarian movement for socialism, it's difficult to imagine what focusing on class would look like.
What?
I said today, when there's no proletarian movement for socialism, it's difficult to imagine what the class struggle would look like. What would be required in the era of Trump to make the potential of the class struggle, or rather the struggle for socialism, a potential issue, political issue again? Sorry. And how far can supporting the anger of the masses go, and also how far can supporting the demands for higher wages and decreased labor time go, without, for instance, a political party mediating those demands. And if I can just take 2 more seconds. For the Second International, it appeared to be the case that the transformation of the imperialist war into a civil war could be a potential for making the class struggle a political issue. Lenin understood this imperialist war to be in part caused by the proletarian movement for socialism, and also creating that potential for the proletariat to vie for power. So in light of that, I'll ask the question again. What would be required in the era of Trump to make the potential of this struggle for socialism a political issue again? Thanks.
Here, no, I want to start this time. Well, first of all, speaking of class an sich, so class for itself, class in itself, according to Marx, can exist even without struggles, but it cannot turn itself into a subject of development or politics or history without becoming class für sich, for itself. And by the way, in one of my articles I use the term class out of self, which means that, that it is so much manipulated that it confuses its own interests with the interests of the bourgeoisie, for example, or the interests of somebody else. But it's a bit of a joke, of course. But anyhow, a sad joke, though. But this is exactly the task of the left now in its recomposition. The point is, it's not just about building a labor or a socialist or whatever party. The point is that through political effort, the recomposition and re-solidarization of the class itself is actually taking place. So in that sense, the left has not only political but social responsibility. The traditional European working class of the late 19th century, early 20th century was not only a product of spontaneous struggle against bourgeoisie, but was also in many ways a product of a political effort of activists, trade union organizers, politicians, intellectuals and so on, who also helped for the class to become class for itself. And finally, by the way, speaking about the party issue, now, first of all, we saw that the movement around Bernie Sanders discussed the third party issue and failed the debate, because it went nowhere, and exactly at the moment when there was a potential. But it's not only because Bernie Sanders was so weak or had made a few wrong decisions, which he absolutely did, and because he was inconsistent. But it's much more than that, because when you read the debate about the third party in the United States, then at some point you start asking, what is it party going to be standing for? Is it, because then you end up reading some debates about the potential of its electoral success or failure. And that's it. It makes no sense if the third party is to be built. It's not just because of the electoral conjunction. It's because of the need for the working parties to exploit the split inside the bourgeoisie, which is a window of opportunity emerging right now, and we should probably disappear later. Okay.
May I? Thank you. I want to answer this question twofold. First of all, I think we are all intellectuals here, and we have to understand what is our role in the class struggle. We have to clarify this. I mean, I think the class struggle is a threefold thing, as we all know, both economic, political, and ideological. And I think we are debating here mainly the ideological issues. And what I can see, or what I can experience, that completely true what Boris says, and it's a good joke with the class out of self. And I think a big thing falls onto the shoulders of the left intelligentsia that has completely given up the idea that a socialist society is possible and does not argue for it anymore. Before it was said, yes, it's normal, but yes, but it's not said. I mean, it's like in a love relationship, at least once in a week you should say I love you, and the same is true with the intellectual. They should clearly say we are standing for the socialist transformation, and this always falls down. And this makes the working class ideologically really disarmed, and it's a fact. And the 1990s had a huge effect on this. Because all the left intelligentsia started to write bad books about communism. I mean, it's true. And so, criticizing their own unstomached past. And the second thing I want to say, how will it, how will this develop? I think Marx in the 18 Brumaire is a very, very deep insight. I'm sorry, I have to translate from German into English, but he asked, he says, basic idea of Marxism, human make their history themselves. There is no automatic thing, okay? And ideas are important to them. But then he adds, but under given conditions and formed by the found traditions. And I think we have to be precise and clear on what tradition left-wing intellectuals stand. And the word was said on class independence, also ideologically, and this means socialism, this means expropriation as the main problem.
Okay, with the same question, I would say that it's a matter of conjuncture on the one hand and of the left on the other hand. If we read the letters from afar of Lenin from the year 1917, that is before the October Revolution, he says that the revolution was made possible, and he refers to the first phase of the revolution, because the set of contradictions was merged in a way that made the revolution possible. And in these contradictions, he also refers to the contradictions between Germany and Russia and the outcome of the war at that time. And because Germany and Austria were in favor, in quotation marks, of the revolution in order to harm the advanced forces. So it's a matter of conjuncture on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's a matter of the left, that is, of the party and so on. And I agree with what Emmanuel and the others said on this matter. If I return to the case of Greece again, we had the masses, the working class and the majority of the people supporting SYRIZA, but not being self-confident and not having a conscious strategy of changing the society. And so when they realized what the leadership of SYRIZA was doing, they became passive. After the compromise, the masses who were filling all the big squares of all the big cities of Greece, Athens, Thessaloniki, and so on, they silenced themselves, because it was as if they had a contract of assignment with this specific party, not being self-confident. And we still live in this phase of passive response of the masses. Of course, there is class struggle, there are some minor mobilizations and so on, but we are in another phase. So it's very important to have clear socialist strategic targets, that is to want to change the society and to have a left that unites with the people on this basis.
You know, one thing about the present moment, in other words, thinking about last year, this year, 2016, 2017, and looking at the changes that are, you know, that we're in the midst of, you know, whether it's the crisis of the EU or the election of Trump, etc. You know, obviously, one of the presuppositions of Platypus, the left is dead. Long live the left. But first we have to acknowledge it's dead, is that, of course, you know, making history, but not of conditions of our own choosing, well, the state of the left is also a condition that just exists. In other words, a subjective factor has become an objective factor. This has been long in the making, actually. And that's one of the reasons why I pointed out that the left has failed to make sense of not only the crisis of neoliberalism now, but really, it's not just that failure, it's preceded by previous failures to make sense of changes in capitalism. Whether the New Deal, you know, the crisis of imperial capitalism, imperialist capitalism, that then led into the American system in the mid-20th century, or the crisis of that system, the crisis of Fordism, Keynesianism, the New Deal coalition, etc., on which, by the way, social democratic parties around the world were refashioned after World War II, meaning they weren't really, you know, in the tradition of the Second International anymore, not even in reformist terms, but they were really just based on the four freedoms of Roosevelt. They never made sense, the left never made sense of neoliberalism, so how could they possibly make sense of its undoing, right, and its transformation? So in that respect, this kind of demoralization, or even the role of intellectuals, this kind of thing, what would it take to, you know, make this crisis political? One of the advantages that historical Marxism had was that Marxism didn't invent socialism or communism. There was already a mass movement for socialism that predated Marx and Engels, and certainly pre-existed in the Marxist parties. You know, the First International was not Marxist. So there was a long history preparing, right, for eventually the history of Marxism. We're dealing with at least 40, 80 years of disorganization, demoralization, misleadership, what have you. So there has to be something, some constituted agency to be able to take advantage of a crisis, to be able to turn a crisis into an opportunity. In other words, by the time the crisis hits, it's not really an opportunity for you know, constituting a left, because the left is going to scramble behind events. I guess the one example that Boris raised, which I think is important, namely the 1890s, there was a crisis in the 1890s, there was a crisis in the 1870s, but there was also a crisis in the 1890s that ended up benefiting Russia in terms of industrialization. That kind of protectionism that you're talking about actually came out of the and then their rapid industrialization. A lot of the industrialization in Russia, though, ended up being in areas that were not part of the Soviet Union, like Poland, for example, and the Western Russian Empire.
No, but also Donetsk, for example.
Well, right. So also, yeah. But it's just this funny thing. I think Rosa Luxemburg talks about bourgeois Russia, and actually a lot of it didn't end up being in Russia after World War I.
Well, things happen.
Right. And so, in terms of what we would take, I think that any crisis of capitalism now is really an opportunity for the right and not for the left. And that was preordained by the last generation at least, and really deeper than that. So it's a sobering thing, but a lot of times the left looks forward to crisis, sort of wants it, right? And I think that in some ways it's just unfortunate. In other words, the crisis of neoliberalism might have been inevitable, but it's also highly unfortunate. And that we need to take a lesson from the reassertion of politics. I mean, I think that Marxism in the age of Trump, if the left doesn't do it, the right will. But that's been true for a long time. That's been true for a long time. FDR was the right. FDR was the right. The New Deal was the right. It wasn't the left.
So we've got Sebastian.
My question was for you, Boris. You said at the beginning that everything is terrible, but then later that you think of the possibility that conditions could get much worse. And the question is, okay, given the death of the left, what does much worse mean, and against what do we measure much worse? Like what's the...
Well, there is a Russian joke about it. What's the difference between an optimist and a pessimist? A pessimist is somebody who says things can't go worse. And an optimist says, no, they can. So I'm an optimist. First of all, I think that although on one hand we see an absolute collapse of the liberal left, especially in the United States, but not only in the United States, well, maybe it's an opportunity. Maybe it's the beginning of the new left. Maybe you guys are the ones who create this other left, right? I really very much hope that. The other thing, however, is that I think that the institutional crisis of American political system and American political democracy is only beginning. Yeah. And there is absolutely no guarantee that this country, which is always presenting itself as the model of stability and the model of institutional political process, which is going uninterrupted since, well, the independence, or almost since the independence, with one minor exception of the Civil War, though. This country is going to stay this way. So there is no guarantee that things will not go out of control and will not lead to some nasty things with an attempted coup d'etat or something like that. Even in the form of impeachment, which nevertheless will be an attempted coup d'etat. And by the way, again, this is very important that the left shouldn't, or at least the conscious people of the left shouldn't allow to be used as just puppets in this kind of this coup d'etat. Anyway, by the way, Chris made a very interesting point about what means things worked and things didn't work. So in that sense, for Reagan, things really worked, not in the sense that Reaganomics worked, but in the sense that he got re-elected. Yeah? But for Trump, ironically, if you take this kind of criteria, for Trump, things would work if he survives 2018.
Yeah.
I think if he survives, really, well, that's good for him. Then he's he's doing extremely well in this case. But what will be the cost of his survival? And what will be the political conditions in America and around the world of that survival, and after that survival, if it happens, when it happens? Finally, I think, well, there is one part of the world which was almost never mentioned, even though I'm here in this room, I mean East Central Europe and Russia. And there is a feeling around the world, which I experience everywhere where I travel, that nothing is going to happen there. I mean, like today they spoke, okay, Moroccans are now going strikes in Spain, so what entrepreneurs are doing, they are bringing in strike breakers from Eastern Europe, of the Romanians and probably Ukrainians will work for wages which are less than those of Moroccans. That's what's happening. Is it going to continue forever? It's not. I guarantee it's not going to continue forever. And, well, the world is globalized, and what is now happening in America will have tremendous effect on everything which is happening not only in Europe, but in Latin America, in China, in India, and in East Central Europe. And I think in that sense, the world we're going to face within 2 or 3 years from now will be very different. And I'm not sure it's going to be a safer or nicer world. But it only means we have tremendous responsibility to go forward with our own politics. And by the way, transitional program was mentioned. And I think it's very correct. Transitional program is essential. But again, we have to rethink the very notion of transitional program, and given the current conditions and the current dangers. So in that sense, it's tremendous theoretical work and practical work which have to be done simultaneously. We cannot have the luxury now of separating theoretical and practical work anymore, because times change.
Okay, so I've got Stefan
I'll speak up. Around 10 years ago, when I was in high school, I first started to learn neoliberalism, and I didn't know about it before, and I was explained that it was more or less a slim state. So I got to know that this is not true, so to speak. And we were talking about the nation here before, and we were talking about capital. So, especially you, Emmanuel, you mentioned that capital loses control over its politicians. And my question would be, isn't there something as a mediation in the form of the state? And you also mentioned the 18th Brumaire of Marx. So, in how far has the capitalist state itself changed over time? Maybe stayed the same over the time, but still has changed with certain policies coming and going, such as the New Deal, such as neoliberalism. So what remains the same about a state? What changes? And what would that mean for the left? When we talk about this problem, the task of the crisis of neoliberalism, yes, we want to address it like in a progressive way.
Well, this is a big question in the short notice. But just obviously it's clear that the state apparatus is made to correct the things. I mean, it's apparatus of a capitalist state is a worked out machine, which is profoundly counter-revolutionary towards the working class, but also it's acting as a channel of capitalist, and obviously it's trying to dump down people like Trump. And there is a conflict institution, that's quite clear. Yes, it's more stable, but if this is enough to, how should I say, to stop the social the process, I would say no. So I will put it like that. And in general, the question of optimism and pessimism, perhaps, I think I'm also an optimist, but not in Boris sense. But what I can see is, I think, generally, and it applies to all stratas of society, what I feel, or I can see that even bourgeois, politicians, or media, Financial Times, economists, when you read the things, they are really gloomy about the future of the general system. And the bourgeoisie cannot fix it. That's the basic base of my optimism. Whether the working class can change it is another question, which is, well, history is done by human itself, but this is at least what we have to try to achieve.
I agree with Emmanuel that the state has a repressive apparatus, which is the, let's say, the administration, the army, the police, the courts of law, and so on, which functions, works in a way as to keep the working class outside of it, and as to be the collective capitalism, that is, through the laws, through what is legal, through the legal framework, to reproduce the capitalist power. On the other hand, we have to think at the limits when we are discussing such issues. And I think the limits is the history of fascism in Italy and of Nazism in Germany, and especially of the Italian fascists, because the so-called national question was not so acute in Italy. The results of the First World War were very different in Italy as compared to Germany. Italy belonged to the Athens in the First World War. It didn't lose major territories as did Germany, and so on. And we have to think how a specific conjuncture brought masses of people to a change in the state, which led to this very reactionary regime. If we look at Italian fascism, or even German Nazism, we are going to see that this very core of the state, that is the repressive apparatus, in many aspects remained the same. However, there was a difference, and the difference came from the party, which was connected with a very special, with a specific strata of the society. So Hitler's say that it's legal, which is to the interest of the German people, and of course he and the party, the Nazi party, defined which is the interest of the German people, shows the modifications that can take place, although this core remains the same. But we always have to think at the limits in order to understand the possibility and the potential of the change in one or other way.
I wanted to say something about, I feel like I'm invoking New Left to a certain degree because of the failure to process neoliberalism, and also because of the discontent with the Keynesian Fordist state, the discontent with the New Deal coalition. So I'm going to invoke another aspect of New Left, namely their anarchism. Because their discontent was with the welfare state. And what I'd offer is, perhaps the orthodox Marxist position, the old Marxist position from before World War I, is still useful in the sense that the essence of the state is the repressive, special bodies of armed men. And in that respect, the welfare state, it can be dated from a few different moments. It can be dated from the New Deal, or it can be dated from the 1870s crisis. It can be dated from Bismarck. I think that the welfare state has always been a police state. It's always a police state measure. In other words, if you are going to have the state distribute goods to the population for whatever reason, if there's a natural disaster, ultimately at the end of the day, it's a police state measure, meaning it's a security measure. You want to make sure that, at least not too much of this stuff is stolen in the process, right? It's always administered, even if a few steps removed, it's always ultimately, so social workers have a plenipotentiary function that is of families, etc. Adorno has a great quote on this, since last night was the discussion of critical theory. He said, you know, an abused woman might have more to fear from the social worker than she has to fear from her husband. Now that cuts against the whole ethos of the last generation. Because the last generation, interestingly enough, the new left had a great discontent. They considered the welfare state to be fascist, right? Like, you look at like the 60s generation, like the kind of radical fringes of it especially, they really were against this organized capitalist state that's very repressive. At the same time, then, what's happened in the meantime, even though neoliberalism is claimed to be libertarian, is that the state is kind of metastasized. In other words, you have all sorts of social dysfunction that's adjudicated by courts. You have all sorts of victim services, this kind of thing. So the welfare state, it's not that the welfare state went away, right? They didn't cut back the welfare state, but they did change its function. And they kept its disciplining function, they kept its police function, they kept that aspect of it. And so, again, the curious thing is, you know, the nostalgia that came later for that state that originally the new left was against. And, you know, Trump taps into, he does, you know, and I think that also Brexit, it taps into a kind of discontent with the state. It is this kind of, you know, neoliberal, liberal, it's got that character to it, that we need to stay cognizant of, because otherwise the left becomes associated with statism, right? Even, you know, in terms of welfarism, it becomes associated with statism. And not just of a national character, because again, the EU, there was a discontent with the EU as a kind of a transnational state, etc., etc.
So I'm going to take one more question and ask the panelists to use that question to give their closing remarks.
Thank you. So I'm going to make my question as general as possible. I'm not sure if I can formulate it correctly. So it's clear there's a general sense of a crisis, and there is raised the possibility that out of that crisis there could be some kind of different, more politicized left response. The problem I have listening to this is, for example, the election of Trump in the United States, the main effect on anything that one would call the left has been to tie the left even more to the Democratic Party. And it's hard to see a path from anything that's actually happening now to a revived left, and particularly a revived left with revolutionary politics. And so then, and when people even talk about a revived left, what I have a sense of is that in practice, whatever the rhetoric that they're talking about, what they really mean is a kind of militant social democracy. So a revived left in the United States would be some kind of socialist party. The question I have is, if after each of these crises, the right has won, right, which is sort of the narrative Chris presented, where is the potential for something happening because of this crisis that is different from the history of the last 50 years, or maybe you want to go back 100 years if you're talking about 2017. Like, is it just that we're just going to go through one crisis after another, and maybe in one of these crises, something different happens, right? And the question is, when you think of a revived left, what sort of concretely do you see the possibilities of that left doing? I mean, is for example, a notion of worldwide socialist revolution really conceivable, or is really what one is talking about a kind of more militant left, which would presumably reproduce the same problems that it had before? And the second question, which goes to the question of the way Trump is perceived as sort of a fascist, is in a global sense what, the word racism was raised before, and racism was specified as not necessarily specifically a biological racism, but a kind of sense of cultural superiority or equated with nationalism. So the question is, what do people on the panel see as the global future for racism, however you want to define it?
Global future for racism.
Should we just go down the original order? In terms of a revived politics, this question of a revived politics, the lesson of the present is largely negative, meaning it shouldn't be a revival of movementism in the sense of a kind of new left movementism, which expressed discontent with the Democratic Party's New Deal coalition and state. But ultimately was just a pressure tactic on it. And actually, they succeeded in undermining the Democratic Party, and then they were horrified that the beneficiary of that was the Republican Party, was Reagan. First Nixon, of course. We shouldn't forget that. And then Reagan. So, in terms of political possibilities, there are some negative lessons to be learned. And there's also, in a sense, the reassertion of politics per se. It could be that Trump is a very weak president, and therefore what you have on display is all sorts of political scrambling and political chaos and attempt to refashion something out of the wreckage on the part of the Republicans and the Democrats. But I think that really what we're talking about, and I'll come back to what I said earlier, is what needs to be constituted in order to be able to take advantage of a crisis and turn it into an opportunity. So Richard, you asked about revived socialist party, right? Social democracy. I do think that the historic meaning of social democracy was crucial and important. Namely, that it came out of the experience of 1848, that there was a tradition of the Red 48ers that Marx and Engels were part of, but it's not restricted to Marxism. In other words, the idea that we're not just talking about a socialist movement, but we're also talking about democratic discontents within capitalism that socialists have to take the lead on, otherwise the revolution will always come to grief. So I wouldn't be so negative or pejorative about the idea of a renascent social democracy if what we mean by that is not post-World War II social democracy. In other words, if it's not just that, just a sort of extension. Yeah, and the interwar social democracy is of course a mixed bag, meaning it is the counter-revolution on the one hand, and on the other hand, there's actually still a process of splits and regroupments between socialists and communists in the 1920s. So I think the Communist Party in Germany became a mass party because ultimately they did split with the Social Democrats, the OSPD. So I wouldn't just be negative about that. And I'd point, to the issue that came up sort of around the edges earlier with Emmanuel and Boris. The transitional program idea, the transitional demands, the original rational core of the transitional program, Trotskyism, transitional program, transitional demands. It's very tricky, right? Because I think that transitional demands have not served the function that they were meant to serve in Trotsky's conception of them. I think that they've come to serve rather just as a kind of way of rallying kind of movementism on the part of propaganda organizations. In other words, that you raise reform demands that can't be met under capitalism, and therefore you show people that they need to be struggling not for reform but for revolution. I think that's kind of a perversion of Trotsky's original intention of transitional demands, which were very much about the 30s and very much about the living memory of the Russian Revolution, the living memory of the betrayals by Stalinism, which is now deeply kind of obscure to us. So, we could say simply that, a struggle for socialism has to come out of an attempt on the part of subaltern people, working class and other people, to make good on the claims that the society makes for itself. In other words, that, what the Socialist Party did in the Gilded Age in the United States was essentially take on what liberalism had abandoned in terms of the social question, in terms of social democracy. And there are precedents for thinking about missed opportunities in the past. So one thing that I thought about a great deal, before Trump got elected, but in the context of a kind of post-Occupy Wall Street, SYRIZA, kind of moment, was the missed opportunity of the Labour Party in the UK, meaning that instead of the collapse of the Liberal Party leading to a Socialist Party in the UK, you got a Labour Party instead. And that's a sort of a deep tragedy that affected things profoundly. Certainly affected, the course of 20th century history, if you think about the fact that Britain was the preeminent capitalist power before World War I. The fact that a major change in British politics did not produce a Socialist Party, but only a Labour Party. So these kinds of lessons need to be kept in mind. In other words, when we talk about splits in the ruling class, we're also talking about splits in parties and in political forms and in those kinds of mediating factors. And unfortunately, we're not in a position, we're not like a social democratic federation like existed in the UK that chooses to join the Labour Party instead of establishing its own socialist party. Right? We're sort of a couple of steps behind the question of what is to be done, actually. Or for instance, when Lenin asked the question of what is to be done, he had the advantage of there being a second international, there being now social democratic parties, and he had the advantage of the fact that the Narodniks had already split. In other words, the left Narodniks had already decided actually we need to be Marxists, and had already gone down that road for more than a decade before he even really arrives on the scene.
But the question is you have a narrative of a series of crises, and after each crisis there's a missed opportunity by the left, and the left seems to emerge completely. So the question is there something different about the present moment that offers more hope than previous crises, or is it just our own shadows?
I don't know if there's more hope, but I think that there's at least a moment of clarification of the task. Right? Because I think that I pointed out in my opening remarks, but also the way the question was formulated in the panel description, was specifically along the lines of it being an opportunity for the right, that we haven't learned that lesson in more than a generation. So, again, I think that one of the things that we can at least do is think about what politics is, rather than assuming, well, first of all, assuming that there is such a thing as the left, that it exists, and that therefore the problem is that it just has a wrong strategy or, lack of consciousness. I think that we're really back to brass tacks. We've been thrown back to a much earlier moment. We can't assume that we're just picking up where Trotsky left off in 1940 or something like that.
Well, I think that if we see the history of major revolutionary events, we will realize that they erupted in a way that nobody could predict. For example, Marx and Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto in February 1848, and then the 48 events took place. But in the Communist Manifesto, we do not see even a word that a big upheaval, uprising, or revolution is going to take place. Socialists and Marxists during the late 19th century were describing the revolution by taking the example of the Commune, the Paris Commune. But nobody had predicted the Paris Commune. and they discussed about the Paris Commune until 1905, when the first Russian Revolution took place, which again was not predicted by Plekhanov or Lenin or anyone else. And after the first Russian Revolution, they started talking about the councils, the Soviets. And of course, the Soviets became a reality in the events of 1917. So, these all events show that there is a potential which is there, but it cannot be predicted when it will become a reality or a breakthrough or a revolution or a major event. But the potential is there. So our task is to keep the spark alive. That is on the level of theory, on the level of theory and critique, to reconsider the idea that because the state is this apparatus, the repressive apparatus, which does not allow the workers' rights to have any substantial existence, we have to destroy the state, what Lenin said. And what does it mean to destroy the state, to open it to other practices and so on, and how this happens. And of course, on the level of political forms of organization, to be present and to be able to create movements. I think that the movements play a very important role. In all cases, we will see that small or bigger groups, but minorities, have played an important role in less important events, as the events that were the starting point of the anti-globalization movement, but also in the major events, as in the Soviet Revolution and so on. So I think that what we have to do today, because we cannot predict when the next major event is going to take place, is to see the potential which is present and to keep the spark alive.
I think I can go on. The idea, the international Marxist tendency, the IND, has the characterization of the epoch as we give three. It's an epoch of wars, revolutions, and counter-revolutions. So what we say, it's a period of upheaval. We don't say that the way to socialism is a triumphal march. Defeat is possible. This is shown by history, and this is shown in practice. But the fact is that capitalists cannot fix their system. So also revolution is possible, and this is what we try to achieve. And to the question of program, transitional slogans. I mean, a land, bread, peace is not exactly a socialist slogan, but it led to the overthrow of capitalism. If there is a mass force with an avant-garde party that takes this slogan to the end, and the question was that capitalism in Russia could not provide land, bread, and peace. In the same way, the slogan, we are the 99%, would be a perfect transitional slogan if you take the political consequences from it. Which means we are the 99%, we want to rule. But it could be a perfect transitional slogan. Any slogan that arises people, that arises masses, and fight this to the end, can be a perfect slogan. And to the question of racism and things like that, I mean, if you look, I insist on what I have said in my first thing, I mean, and I'm very thankful to John. We have to history is a mixture of gradual change and rapid change. And I insist that the spontaneity of the working class movement, the uprising of the downtrodden masses, this is the motor force of history also today, and we have experienced a lot of these in the last years. Starting with the year 2000, the revolutionary cycle in Latin America, in Bolivia, in Venezuela. The Arab Spring, which was an incredible outburst of a very raw mass movement with the biggest demonstration in human history, with 17 million power in the streets in the fight against Morsi II Egypt revolution. And it ended in a defeat, and I would add in a temporary defeat. There is no guarantee in history. The only thing what we as intellectuals can and should do is to have a clarity in program, to organize, and I would say, like Lenin said in Vastu, in what to be done, and audacity, intellectual audacity, and yes, like Toto said, audacity, audacity, audacity. That's the problem for me today.
Okay, nothing fails like failure and nothing succeeds like success, as you know. So in that sense, even if we are looking at defeats, these defeats at least have one positive aspect. They can teach us lessons. Can. Not necessarily do. Speaking about the actual topic of Trump as the name which characterizes the times we are in. I think for the left it means the end of elitist, middle-class, liberal left. It is the final failure and destruction of this kind of left, and I think this is good news. Good news. And that means that the opportunity emerges for the recomposition, which also involves split. This is very important. Unless you are ready to split from the people who have a strategy totally opposed to your strategy, there will be no recomposition. That's another big error. That was the famous line of Lenin: first, to get united, we first have to get divided. And sometimes people laughed at that, but that was not a joke, and that was not a mistake. First, you need certain clarity that you can be united with people who don't share your views, but up to a point. And then historically, sometimes you come to a point when you have to split. And I think this is the time when, if anybody wants to have not only a revolutionary left, but any kind of class left, or any kind of left which is consistent politically, have to split with the kind of left which is based on identity politics and all sorts of basic neoliberal values which are presented as progressive values and which are and they're not. Actually, the book I'm writing now, I will call it From Discourse to Class. So we have to break with the discursive kind of politics based on discourse rather than class interests. Second, and this is about the future of racism. The future of racism is a problem that race became just a term of discourse.
Yeah.
You see? So in that sense, what do we mean? Yeah, of course there is racism, but whether what we mean by racism is what really is racism is a different story. So, speaking about militant social democracy, I totally agree with Chris. Not only I think that this is something which we should welcome, but I think this is an inevitable stage through which we have to pass in order to get somewhere further beyond that stage. Why? Because exactly we have to reflect in our practice the actual state of the class itself. So given the situation where the class is hardly a class for itself, but rather a class in itself, given the fact that it is very much decomposed, very much split, divided, and disorganized in its class practice, possibly the first stage towards recomposition and realignment of the working class or the labor class, whatever we call it, by the way, because it's not just about blue-collar workers, of course. So the first stage will definitely take the form of either militant social democracy or even left populist movements. And in that sense, by the way, Corbyn in Britain or Bernie Sanders, they also represent some objective logic. The question is whether they consciously can go beyond that logic or they can't. As far as I know, even in the case of Corbyn, who is much better than Sanders according to my taste, but he is not capable of developing a kind of agenda which moves his movement further rather than just reproducing itself. Okay, but speaking about the agenda, for the United States, quite a lot was formulated during Sanders' campaign. Again, speaking about demands, they were not so bad. I think they were good. What were these demands? And they're very clear. They're on the table. Universal health care, free college. Actually, American capitalism is very backward, even if you compare that with Western Europe. So, yeah, it is capitalist reform, making American capitalism less backward in social terms. But still, it was a very mobilizing demand. But also we can speak about labor rights, about public spending, about public investment, and so on and so on. It's not going to be anything radical. But given the current situation in the world, it's a tremendous step forward. And it's like changing the agenda. Giving you an opportunity to speak about something which goes beyond market logic. The important thing is whether you can propose and defend something beyond market logic and convince people to support. Once they support that, they will support quite a lot of other things. This is the first necessary step. So we have to pass through the stage of left populism, I think. But we have to understand, it's just one stage. And we have to go through the stage and go beyond that. And that's exactly the strategy for some kind of social transformation. Thank you.
You'll just have to meet people out front to find out where it is.
The address is there. The address is there.
Okay, cool. Have fun. So yes.